Okay. So today we're going to talk about the everyday life in parishes, and in particular we're looking at the possibility, well, more than possibility, the plan to go ahead with looking at individual parishes for each meeting going forward for some months, perhaps the next year, in the 1790s. So what was everyday life like for those people in that parish who lived there? What sort of place did they live in? What was the work that brought in income to them? What sort of housing? What sort of activities did they do? How did they stay there? Did they go on to other places? These sorts of things. I'll just click on here and go on. So it's going to be in two parts. I'm going to first talk about how you might find sources of information for this research into each of these parishes, where you might find a source or a number of sources. And then in the second half, I'll just present a parish as if it's the topic for the day, you know, like, so that'll be probably about the first half hour. We'll talk about where you might go, if you're going to do the research of a particular parish, where you might go to find the sources of information that you'll use to prepare the notes for the talks that others might present. I'm not asking you to necessarily do the presentations yourselves, but I found this very successful in the past. If somebody prepares 3 or 4 pages, just 3 or 4 pages of notes, which is enough for 45 minutes of talking, and then maybe some pictures to go with it, some maps, that sort of thing, and then put those into a PowerPoint if you want to. If you can't do that, that's fine. And then somebody else might present them. In fact, in some cases, it might be presented by somebody in one of the zones and somebody else in another zone. That would be fine too. And some people might volunteer to do that. So, everyday life. Sources. These are broadly the sources we're going to talk about today. We've got the Old Statistical Account will be our key document that we'll use. These are these things, I'll tell you more about them in a minute, but they've got already some headings in there that will be used for the subparts of the topic, aspects to look at for that particular place. We'll look at who were the ministers in those parishes, because of course they played an important part in people's lives, and there's this document called the FASTI, which we'll talk about in more detail today. Then we'll go and look at where you might find old maps, in particular the National Library of Scotland, NLS. And then we would like to look at what MacLennans lived in these parishes. What were they like? What occupations did they have? Where had they come from? Where did they go to? And what sort of families they had, you know, these sorts of aspects. We can actually see our real people living there in this parish from our own database. And you can come up with some examples of people who live there. The Old Statistical Account. How many of you, put your hands up if you know it, if you've looked at an Old Statistical Account yourselves before? No, no, no. It's a vast and rich volume of work that is used by family historians to find out about the life in the parish, written a contemporary account by people who know the parish and know the people in the parish. It's the thoroughly Enlightenment idea, this idea that by collecting information we can understand better what's happening and make improvements. This fellow from the very north of the mainland of Scotland, born in Thurso, and in 1754, he was right there, you see, in the Enlightenment times, you know, that this is implementing in that practical way that Scots did, the Enlightenment. You know, the Encyclopedia Britannica, for example, was a practical example of the Enlightenment in action, you know, as opposed to being a theoretical thing that was talked about in universities and the like. This is a practical thing that people actually did. And he was passionate about agricultural reform in particular, you know, improving the way crops and animals were produced so that they could do better at it, using scientific methods. So he wrote out to the ministers in each parish, and as a result got over 900 reports from each of the parishes written by the ministers over the period from 1791 to 1799. And he, of course, had a bit of trouble in the later stragglers, you know, didn't get them in. But part of his thing was that he went about, you know, chasing up the recalcitrants and making sure they sent their reports in. These were aimed to document and organise the demographic information, the social, the economic understanding of the parish, the social life there, and to try to improve the life for the parish. This is what the first page of the book looks like, you know, and you can see here all these Enlightenment ideas coming through into this world, and the progress of political society from a pastoral state to that of luxury and refinement. You know, it's a very, this is part of the understanding of history that the Enlightenment had, where they had these phases of life from, you know, primitive through to sophisticated civilization, and that's, you know, thoroughly Enlightenment, that idea. So drawing up accounts of either of parochial or other districts to collect statistical philosophy, a source of national improvement. They're the sort of aims you see right there in the cover. When you want to find it, these things, you go to this web address here. It's a funny sort of web address. It's a joint project between the University of Edinburgh and Glasgow, and just has this web address. So that's the Edina part. It's something to do with Edinburgh. I don't know quite how it is, but if you just Google, you know, Old Statistical Account Scotland or something like that, you'll easily come up with an address that looks like that, and you'll know you've got the right one. There is also a new statistical account. You'll be surprised to hear. If there's an old one, there's bound to be a new one, isn't there? And the new one covers the period around the 1840s. So the 1840s one is quite a, you know, different perspective on life in those parishes, the same parishes, to those in the 1790s. But we're just dealing with the 1790s, and we want to keep a focus on just that window there. It's quite an amazing point in time, and not get too far ahead of ourselves by looking at the 1840s. We'll save that for another year. This is what you get to see. If you go to that address there, you can see I've got that. That's that address. Sorry for much chin. I'll just get the pointer going. You can see the address that I just talked about up there, and then you get this map over here that you can click on to find the particular parish that you're interested in, or part of Scotland. The old statistical account, because they sent in their reports just, you know, haphazardly when they got them done, and some of them had to be chased up. They're published in a totally random order. You know, they just put them into the books as they came in, whereas the new statistical account is organised by district, and you get all the ones for that district in the book. But it doesn't matter a great deal to us, because you just go to this map and you click on the map. And Ross-shire, for example, or Sutherland, or whatever it is you're looking for, and you get the list of parishes in that, and you get to see both the old and the new statistical accounts. That's it. And if I go to the next page, once I click on that for Ross-shire, you get to see all the Ross-shire parishes there, and then you get to choose whether you want the old or the new for that parish. Now, the one we're going to deal with later today is this one, Alness, as it's pronounced, and that happens to be the first one, so that's a good thing, isn't it? That I'm demonstrating the first one from the list there in the book, in the parish, in the county of Ross-shire. And down here you get to see the a description of the county that we're looking at. That's drawn from some other source, not from this source. But I've also got there noted that they have these terrific maps from that period. They're quite old maps that, you know, sort of predate the maps. Maps are actually not as prevalent in this time, the 1700s, as you might expect. Mapping, like the Ordnance Survey maps, for example, didn't really come along until the mid-1800s. There are an enormous number of subjects covered by these things, but you will have seen that sample that I sent to you just a couple of hours ago has only a limited number of topics, and I'll get onto those in a sec, but they were given 171 questions, and some of those might have several parts, so, you know, it's a lot of questions that they were prompted to answer in their reports. And of course, some ministers were particularly interested in some subjects. You know, one one I remember was keen on birds, and so you know, he put an extra section in about which birds migrated to his parish and what time they came and how many there'd been in the last few years. You know, like typical Twitcher sort of interest, and so on. So they're a bit personal, but also the that at first they were going to rewrite them based on the reports the ministers sent in, and then they decided that they would just let the ministers speak for themselves. And so they're not really filtered or, you know, standardized or anything. They're just the voice of the minister writing about his people. And I think that gives a sort of genuine, contemporaneous feel to these documents that, you know, you wouldn't have got if they'd just been edited up into standard layout. The important thing is to notice that the answers are not just what we would today call statistical, you know, meaning like total population and analysis of the population into groups and that sort of thing. But they're some of it is subjective and more impressions and so on from the writers. Yeah, so things like customs and morals and character, you know, this sort of thing. Naturally, you'll get some description of the geography of the parish, the history of the parish, the economy, you know, what people had, what sort of work they could do, how many people, what they were like, the age analysis, and their customs, those sort of things. And there you go. He decided to just publish it and let the ministers speak for themselves. The one we're going to look at as a sample today is this Alness, as it's pronounced. It's in an area of Scotland that we haven't yet dealt with in our run around the country. You know, we started with the West Coast ones, and then we went to the Outer Hebrides in another session, and then we went to the Black Isle, and now we're going to this area just north of the Black Isle in Scotland there. And these are the main headings. That's all you get, you know, that's all you need to think about. The situation, meaning like where is this parish? How big is it, that means? What sort of soil it has and what sort of products does it produce? Who are the landowners, the heritors in the parish? What's the valuation and the rental that's charged? What's the population of the parish? The state of the church and the manse, that's the, you know, where the minister lives. The character of the people and language. They're the main headings in this particular parish we're going to look at. Others would have slightly different ones to that, but that's what we have here. So that's dealt then with the OSA, the Old Statistical Account. Now we're going to talk about the FASTI. Anybody heard about the FASTI? Have you ever looked it up before? Turn your mic on and say yes, no. This is really a great little source of history, and it's much different to what you might expect. It's a bit of a surprise if you start looking at it. FASTI, it's a Latin word meaning calendar, actually, and this of course means church and this means Scotland. So but what it is a listing of the ministers in each parish chronologically, you know, so that you get a description of the minister, where he was educated, where he grew up, who his parents were probably, who his children were, who his children married, you know, something maybe about their character even, what they're like. So that it's quite a little treasure of a resource, this FASTI. You've got to remember that the established church in Scotland, the church that we know well, was only organised in 1690. So when we're looking at 1790s, we're looking at a period only 100 years after it was established, the church. And of course, you know, by the 1790s, and say the 1750s even, it was still a bit in embryo, you know, it was still organising itself. For example, there's a MacLennan who's a minister in the parish of Fodity about the time of Culloden, the 1750s, and he was instructed by the synod that he was to go into the Strathconnan. You know, now you know who's in the Strathconnan, lots of MacLennans, right? He was instructed to go out and conduct missions in the Strathconnan, that is, to try and establish church presence there and get people won over to the church. But he refused to do it for fear of his life. It was too dangerous, he said, to go there and talk to these people about the Bible. So he, as a result, they disbarred him from being a minister. They chucked him out from his role until he became contrite and apologetic, and then he was reinstated. But that's an indication of how the state of flux that the church was in as recently as, you know, 1 generation, 2 generations before the time we're talking about. It's a very big thing, 10 volumes. Various places have this document. The Family Search has it. That's a, you know, a Mormon thing. Ancestry, another Mormon thing, has it too. But this place, archive.org. Some of you know this archive.org. We did talk about it once before, I believe. Archive.org? No? No? Kathy's shaking her head. You remember that at one stage Google were going around scanning books all over the place. You know, I think Stanford Library and places like that. And they had this process by which they could make digitized books from old, out of copyright books originally. And they did lots and lots of books, you know, and then there was decided that rather than it be a Google project, it would become this more philanthropic institution that would hold these books for the general benefit of the world. And so this archive.org was set up, and Google donated all its books to that collection, as did some other book scanners, so that this is a huge collection of digitized books that is easily searchable, and you just put that into your Google search and you'll put archive.org in the search terms and you'll get to find things, and you find copies of this FASTI in there to read in archive.org. It has over 2,000 ministers, and they're often lots about their families and all that sort of thing, especially marriages and the children and the siblings and so on. So you can find quite a lot. If you're looking at a particular parish and you go to this FASTI, and you can find about the former ministers in that parish, the current minister, who was his successor, who were his children, who his children married, all these sorts of things, you know. What his nature was like, sometimes you get that too. That's FASTI. So for example, this is a page from the National Library of Scotland version of this book, the digitised book in the National Library of Scotland, and this is the minister in that parish. You can see here this heading, Alness, is this, and that's how much you get about him. And in fact, you get a little bit about his son, because his son succeeded him in this parish. You can see here we've got phrases. That's a very interesting thing, the phrases. I'll talk to you about that when we come to the actual session. But what I learned from, you can't read that obviously, so I've just put a little bit of it in here. You can see that he's the son of a John Bethune of Glen Shiel. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Come on, you can, Barb, do it, Barb. You can tell me what Glen Shiel is. No, somebody else? It's a part of the former larger parish of Kintail, the MacLennan homeland. So when you see that that church that appears in the top corner of all of our clan genealogy pages, that former church that's the burial ground called Clackenbuick, it's really the burial ground for Kintail, the historic burial ground of Kintail, the churchyard. And it's because Glen Shiel was only excised, taken out of Kintail in the 1740s. This is still the burial ground for the Glen Shiel folk. You know, it's the shared one because it historically was the graveyard for the larger Kintail parish. So that's where it is. It's on the left side as you go towards, you know, Islindonan, the famous Mackenzie Castle. And you approach the head of that loch there, Loch Buick. It's the left-hand side of that. There's a place called Letterfern there, that sort of thing. I can see my wife's waiting to be admitted. Yeah, so this gives you in the FASTI something about the people. He was a minister in Harris, admitted to Gairloch. He translated it, that's the word used there, and admitted to Alness, this parish that we're talking about here. He married a Munro, a daughter of a colonel, Andrew Munro, and he was replaced by his son when he died. This is all you find out all this about this person who is in that parish from this document. Now looking at maps, you can see here that this is the address National Library of Scotland, has maps, quite a lot of maps. It's a little bit tricky to find, I've got to say, when you go to the main NLS web page. You could put that address in if you can remember it, but the other way to do it is to look at, just click on the main maps home page, and then even then it's quite hard to find old maps. You know, you can find lots of Ordnance Survey maps and more modern maps, but you find the old ones a bit tricky, and the trick is to put the word, to look at the word Scotland, and then in Scotland it has the older maps. And here's one that we're looking at that's from 1794. You can see there, if you could read those. Oh no, there's no date there, but that's the date they tell us. It's from 1794. And it has mainly roads, not so much other things, but roads. This is the same map that I'm just talking about, and I'm showing you this is what we would do going forward. This is where this parish that we're going to talk about today is located. This is the Black Isle, you'll remember. Here's Fort George on the other side of that we talked about in our last meeting. And these are some Black Isle places, slightly different spellings and different names and so on. Redcastle, Logie, Urquhart, Ferntosh, you know, these names here. And there's a little ferry goes across here. And these are the places on the other side from the Black Isle that we haven't looked at previously. There's some big mountains in here. You see these lakes up in here, 2 lakes. Just remember those 2 lakes because they're going to appear in future maps. And then going further out here, you can see here, Wivas, Ben Wivas, the mountain, the high mountain in that area. And it gives you the measurements in the old money there. It's about, what, 1,100 meters, something like that. And so this, you come along here and you can see up the top, sorry, you can see up the top there, maps home, and then it says maps of Scotland, 1560s to 1940s. That's the clue. That's the one you want to look for on the main site to find these older maps. And the place we're going to look at today is about halfway along, and this is actually it here, this wording, and you can tell by that lump that that's the one we're looking for, and just keep those 2 lakes in mind up there, because that's they define the boundaries, the rivers coming out of those. Now looking at some other sources. I have a photo of this place myself that I took, but I couldn't find it at the time, so I just used the Street View map from Google. And this is in the High Street in the village of Alness. You can see it says High Street on there. Maybe you can read that. And it's really, some of these are very good. Some of them are not so good, not so enthusiastic and not so thorough. But, you know, I went into this little one here and had a bit of a poke around and found a few things. It never hurts to go and see what you come up with. In fact, that guy that I talked about, you know, from that Sutherland parish, who yesterday sent me all that information, very helpful. Some of them don't have, you know, stuck in older ways too, some of the places. But, you know, some of them might be helpful. You could, if you're doing a parish, you might find there's a local history group that you can contact and find some more information from them. I've got to tell you about the Alness Library, because it's just this tiny little place. It's back along the street in a westward direction on the other side. And there's this little, I'll just kill that. There's this little library, tiny little thing, you know, like the size of a couple of schoolrooms. And it was in there that I, just by poking around, I went to the section of the library that had local history. And I thought, oh, I wonder what's in here, flick, flick, flick. And I came across one of these boxes, you know, these sort of boxes like this that, you know, have just loose bits of paper in them. And that was just in the local history shelf. And I flicked through all the things that were in there. And that was where I came up with the transcription of the Inverness Courier from the time when the monument to Captain Donald MacLennan of Dingwall had been had been published. It was just loose, just 4 or 5 pages of printed, paper, loose in this box like that. And that's where I found out about, that he'd been all around the world in around 1800, about the time we're talking about. He had been often to India on ships, and he had been to South America and been captured by Spaniards, and his brother got killed by the Spaniards when they got captured. He then went to Tahiti and then on to New Zealand. For many months he was in New Zealand in 1803. This is really early times for New Zealand. And then he came to Sydney, and then he went to Tasmania within weeks of the first settlement being established there. And I read all this in this library, found this document in this little box in the library. So you never know what you're going to come up with. That's the sort of point of that story. And it's really nice to look at local newspapers, actually in paper too, rather than see them online, if you can find them by going there or something. Here's another thing I found. These are some of the people we're going to talk about. This is a book about Scots in Latin America, and it talks about this fellow here we've been talking about, Reverend Angus Bethune, and how one of his sons died in South America, from disease there, Berbice. And then his cousin, this is his brother here, this fellow here, Reverend John Bethune in Dornoch. His cousin, the second son, John, died in Berbice as well in 1804. So around this time we're talking about there. They're alive there. Now, of course, these people came from that Glen Shiel parish. You've got to keep remembering that. Okay, so that's the first part of our session, dealing with the sources. I talked about other sources there you might find as well. So now we're going to go on to talk about, we're going to present as if we're doing the talk about this particular parish and what to expect if you come to prepare one of these talks about or research one of these topics about a parish. So I can give you a template. You could, if you wanted to do the PowerPoint stuff, I could give you a template like this that you could put your slides into if you want to. Or otherwise, just send the pictures and we can put them in. Somebody will do it. So, hello, welcome to today's session about everyday life in the parish of Alness in the north of Scotland. It's lovely to have you all here today, and so on. In today's session, we're going to be looking at the parish of Alness, and we're going to use the Old Statistical Account, the FASTI, maps and other resources to better understand everyday life in this parish in the 1790s. Such things as topography, location, extent and produce, who the landlords, heritors were, and the minister, who he was and what he stood for. Look at the population that was there, the sort of employment people had, the morals of the people, the poor, maybe something about their health and housing and diet, if we can find any of that. How many MacLennans lived there, and maybe just to finish off, a bit of humour with some curiosities that you might find if you were to go there and look for yourself. So let's start today, shall we? Here's the Old Statistical Account for this particular parish that we're talking about, and here's an example of the page that starts this account. It starts off by saying that the minister, notice that the S is written with like an F there, not a typo. See, up here, can you see that? The minister, Reverend Angus Bethune, was the author of this beaten, it's said in Scotland quite often, of this report. And he did it in 1797. So he's one of the stragglers, right? Because they've been coming in since 1791. It tells you in this section here what the origin of the name is. Now, probably some of you know this word alt, or A, sometimes spelled A-L-T, sometimes spelled A-double-L-T. And here's another variant of it, A-U-I-L-T, means a brook or a stream or a small river. Is the first part of the name. And then the other part, Ness, it means a point or a headland or something in that sort of, or a promontory. So that's the sort of origin of the name that he talks about in that part. And then the next part of the thing he's talking about, the situation, the extent, the soil and the produce. So that's gives you a pretty good understanding of what is the engine room of this part of the world. Here we can look at a map. Now this map is, you'll see a map that comes directly from our own database. So if you go into documents and just Google map or Ross Shear or something. That's probably not very good, Ross Shear, because there'd be a lot of responses to that. No, map will do. And you'll get this map to look at the particular parish we're dealing with. And here it is up here. So here's the Cromarty Firth, here's, you know, Inverness down here, here's Fort George here, here's the Black Isle that we've been talking about before. And then this is the parish in here. You can see, as the minister says, that there are two locks or lakes, and here's the one and here's the other. This river comes down here and comes down, becomes the boundary of that parish. Here's the other lock, comes down here, becomes the boundary of that side. And of course, these lumps that stick out into the Firth, you can even see them in this rather crude map, are the result of wash coming down from the rivers. That's all the headland is that we just talked about. He says that it's 12 miles, 19 kilometres long. That's that direction, 19 kilometres. You can see a map up here, a scale up here. And then he says that it varies in width, as you can see there in that map. And then this country is high country, this light coloured, indicating higher areas, and the parish goes up into those higher areas. So that's an interesting thing. Here's an old map itself, not that schematic map, which has the same two locks, 1, 2. Here's the river coming down, here's the headland sticking out. Here's the other lock, here's the river coming down, here's the headland sticking out there. And on here you can see a number of places. The churches, this blue thing is the churches. Now, it's interesting to note that this church, you see, the current town of Alness is here, and it's called Bridge of Alness, that little area, like Bridge End is another name that's used there. And this is an estate here that is owned by Munro, and this is the main estate we're going to look at, Novar. And here you've got this word friarish. That's a word that's going to come up in the later parts of the session. And here's a word, asint. And that's another word that's going to come up. It's another estate. Yeah. So, and you can see also here, I'll have to go down to here, Ben Wivers, that's the mountain that we saw before. In fact, I quite like this map because on here you can see where my Catherine and my great-great-grandfathers was born here, just right near that church. He was just in here, he was born. Or he was born and baptised here. And we can see too, Kathy, that this is Clare, where his wife came from. He was baptised there not long after the period we're talking about, over 200 years ago, no, 1815. So, you know, I quite like this map and has a personal meaning to me and useful to me in terms of finding where our ancestor came from. So this is a more modern map, but it illustrates the use of the nature of the use of the soil. Here, Reverend Bethune describes it as having higher parts of the parish lying beyond the ridge of hills, which obscure, there should be a word in there, or conceal or something, them from the eye of the traveller on the public road. So if you're travelling up here on the public road, as he calls it, you don't see this other developed area here behind these hills that run along here. But you can see, you know, all this farming land on the Black Isle, and then you can see across here all this farming land even today along the coast of the loch. Yeah. So think about this. This is part of what we're talking about here. This area up in the higher country, and of course, the parish goes even beyond where this satellite view does, and you can see Ben Wivers there again. So this is his description from the Old Statistical Account. He says the ground is mostly arable, generally light soil, seldom produces luxuriant crops. That means it's not that good. And then he says, you know, there's a bit of a judgment here. When the farmers are industrious, in other words, they might not always be, Their labour is rewarded by a middling return of oats, barley and peas, and abundant crop of potatoes. This is the foundations of the future potato famine, isn't it? Coming in another 50 years from, or 40 years from when we're talking about. He says, and he has a very personal judgment here that says almost all the farming is done in open fields, meaning not fenced off into particular owners, but farmed communally. If a different mode was employed, it could produce a third more than it does now, meaning by better techniques would be practiced if they owned it personally, fenced it off. Becomes quite controversial soon after this. The enclosures, it's called, that's the word that's used. This is now the higher part that he's talking about, that part obscured by the mountains that you can't normally see. And this also is from the Old Statistical Account. He says, up there is produced some bare and some black oats. Now this word here, bare, I gather, I've talked to a few people since, it's a Scots word for barley. It's more often written B-E-R-E, barley. And of course used for making what? Whiskey. And black oats for porridge. Meal, that's what that means, making meal. But it's rather than growing crops, it's chiefly used for grazing. A considerable number of black cattle. Remember we saw in the very first session the black cattle, how that was an important source of income for Scots in these times. There were good markets for black cattle, and that the black cattle was more important than the ones you more often see on the postcards with the red hair, the redheads. They were more of a Victorian idea that that was cute. But black cattle was the thing, and some small horses also reared, which is an interesting thing, isn't it? And we know from looking at our own accounts that one of our MacLennan people who lived in that upper part, this part here, her father she was born in the 1790s, and her father was a milliner, miller, like not a milliner, a miller. So he milled some of these oats that were grown up there, presumably from a water wheel, not from steam at this stage. Maybe the steam was introduced later. And then he says, still higher up, there is rich heath country affording pasture in the summertime to those farmers who don't have sufficient pasture of their own on the lower country, right? So this is a big part of daily life for Scots in this time. They go off to what are called the shieldings, in the higher parts in the summer to graze their cattle on the and sheep later on the pastures and heath and the higher country that is not suitable for living on permanently. But they migrate quite a lot of their family there. Sometimes the men go off to do work elsewhere and so on. But the kids and everything all go there and have a wonderful time, I gather. That's a bit of a part of the social life of being Scottish, that, if you're poor and Scottish, you take your animals off to the higher country in the summer and have a long party, in the warm weather. Now, dun, da, da, dun, da, 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 the sheep is arriving, right? This is what we're seeing. By looking at this particular period, we're just starting to see the introduction of sheep. And why did we get sheep being introduced? We got them because the mills were now converting over to this new fangled steam engine power and could accommodate as much wool as they could be sent. So, essentially the demand for wool was growing from the invention of the steam engine and the use of it in the mills in Lancashire and elsewhere. So I won't read all this, of course, but, he says they're recently introduced on the higher grounds. That means up in this part of the parish, the extended heaths and some of the glens up there. He says that people are being removed from their historic parts where they lived, but the proprietors in this parish have who have let any part to sheep farming can properly assure us that such tenants as had been removed from their possessions for that purpose were otherwise provided in farms by these gentlemen, that means the landlords, either on their own estates or in some others in their vicinity. So, you know, it's quite interesting to read this contemporary account of what was actually happening. Who were these landlords? That's what you've got to think to yourself. Here are the names of the main proprietors, as they're called, landlords, heritors in this part of the world. You can see there's a name here that's pretty common. In Scotland, they say it like Monroe, like that, emphasising the second vowel. How would you say it? How would you say it, Carolyn? She's gone. Susan, you might have a take on that. Unmute.
I'd say Monroe.
Monroe, would you? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Well done. No, you wouldn't spell it the way MacLennan spelled it, though, would you? In this context, you know, they never use that spelling in Scotland. So Munros are a big part of this part of the world. That's what you can see from there. This is that name there that we saw on the map a minute ago. And you can see that that fellow and this one are both resident in the parish, whereas these others are outsiders, you know, they're absentee landlords. This one here, though, becomes the dominant landlord in the parish by a long way. This one here establishes a distillery about this time that is still there today, making. We had someone from the parish who joined us yesterday, and he said he'd been there, and he knew his dad worked there at this distillery. Good, eh? So, who are these Munros, as we call them? They actually are a bit of a different clan to many others, like our own. They have a different history. Traditionally, they're thought of as having arrived in Scotland at the invitation of the kings of Scotland to be mercenaries, that is, you know, paid soldiers for against the Vikings. They'd come from Ireland to here in the 11th century or thereabouts, you know, so well after the migrations of most clan folk from Ireland in the 800s and 900s. This is some hundreds of years later. They were established themselves on the lands on the north side of Cromarty Firth generally, and that's what we've seen. The principal seat of the clan is at this place that's called Foolis, sometimes spelt with a W, and it includes the Mount Wivis that we saw there before. There's its measurement in proper numbers, a bit over 1,000 metres. Yeah, so it is a, you know, there's this term Munros, you know, Munros, you know that? It's a climber's term. It's from any mountain over 3,000 feet, or 920 metres, I think it is there for bagging, that's what they call it. How many Munros have you bagged? That's the way they talk about it. It means that you walk to the top of them. And people try and do some number of them in a day, or, you know, in a week or something. A day would be a good thing if you can bag 3 Munros in a day. They're doing very well. And some of the peaks at Kintail, you know, the sisters are Munros, and so you can do one, you go down a little bit, then you come up the next one, and you know this term? Yeah, you must know it. Munros. It's a big, you've got to know it if you're part of it. This area that's on the north side of the Firth is called Furindonald, and it's a Gaelic word. This is the full name here, Furindonald, or Donald's land in English. That's what it's called, this land that was granted to the Munros in exchange for their services as mercenaries to rid the country of the dreaded Viking. And this gives you a feel, this picture of what the land is like that we're talking about. This is the Cromarty Firth here. So we're looking at it from the Black Isle. You can see the Black Isle's been, this must be, I suppose, late winter, something like that. Because you can see this is being ploughed for planting. We're looking across the Cromarty Firth, and you've got this little strip of land here that goes up to some lower hills, tree covered, And then beyond that, you've got Ben Wivers. So, you know, this is quite a good picture to show us what the countryside is like in this parish. Here's where you can find a definitive answer on all things Munro. This book here is available in that archive.org that I mentioned. This is 18 something written there. And it's got not only the Munros of Scotland, but also has those in New England and Lexington. I guess that's the Lexington in Massachusetts, huh? Probably. I don't know. I didn't look at it. But that's, you know, this is the book. You can read it online. And out of that, I extracted, I flicked through and saw that it would be no surprise that Munros generally were military involved because of their history, but also they were successful merchants, clergy, and doctors. This is the sort of thing you find Munros doing. In particular, Sir Hector, General, that's a military title, Sir, meaning he's got a knighthood, Hector, who calls himself the 8th of Navarre, that's his estate, and he's got these predecessors. You can see there he was born in 1727. He went to India in 1760, to Madras in 1777, and then he returned to Scotland before he went back to India and stayed there for a while before he went back to India again. And eventually he retired as a full general in 1798. So he's a big wig, this guy. He got quite a lot of money from his time in India. It's a bit, someone might like to research where he got the money from. But he used it when he came back to purchase some of the surrounding estates from other Munros. You see there in 1786, he bought from James Munro these other parts of, this is where Cathy, our ancestor, was born, Colcraigie, and that land had been acquired by Sir Hector of Navarre. And there he is. Very nice too, Susan. You like that? And he's the kingpin in this town because of all the wealth that he brought back from India. That's the main thing to know. He entered the army, as we say. His first task after he entered the army was tracking down Jacobites. So it'll be no surprise once you know the history of the family, meaning that they were mercenaries for the king, that they were, you know, supporters of not of the king against the Jacobites. And so that was his first mission, Jacobite rounding up. And they did that very effectively, as we know. And then he went to Bombay as commander of the 89th Regiment in 1761. And these events here are very pivotal in the history of Britain in India. He took the surrender from the French at this place. He suppressed the sepoy mutiny in Patna in 1764. And in this battle here, he was greatly outnumbered, like, you know, not 10 to 1, but something like that order. And nonetheless succeeded in winning against the Moguls in that part. And it may be from this battle that he got his wealth. So some of these things here are some of the most decisive battles in India for the British. As I say, he had 2 periods in India. In the second, he returned to take command of this All East India Company before it was a government thing. He took command of the company's Madras Army. That's down in the southeast of India. And on his return there, he was elected to the Parliament of Britain for Inverness. He became the member for Inverness. And even during his second trip to India, he retained that position. He lived at Fort George, as you might expect, when he came back. But then he poured some of this money he got from India into expansion of his estates and agricultural improvements. He died in 1806, unmarried, but he recognised 3 children. 2 boys were killed in India, one taken by a shark and the other by a snake, I think it was. And then leaving Jane, the girl, to inherit his estate. These are, children from outside marriage. and he is succeeded to some extent by his brother. So he bought all these extra lands, and he finished up with 8,000 hectares. That's 20,000 acres in the old money. And as he did a number of things, agricultural improvement usually meant draining things and you know, improving the soils and so on. But also he planted more than 750,000 trees in forests. Made the forestation is part of what he did. This is an example here of Scots pine trees, and you'll see these all over Scotland. You remember seeing them. Scots pines, and there's not actually in that particular parish, it's in the Cairngorms, but it illustrates that the forestation is done up to the level of the tree line, the natural tree line, because, you know, up here, of course, trees don't thrive. It's too high and too cold. Yeah. They built he spent £120,000 on estate improvements. You know, that's a huge amount in today's money. And they built these grain stores that are called gurnals that are quite controversial. Some of them have been demolished in recent years as being, you know, risky, in risk of falling over. But you know, of course, grain stores are an important element in being able to grow grain and store it and then ship it south or sell it or whatever. And he built what are called sheep walks. That's a lovely term, isn't it? Sheep walks. This is before barbed wire, of course, we're talking here. This is the home that he enlarged when he had all this money he brought back from India. And a little bit of this is today's picture. A little bit of it's the more modern part. These attics are more modern, but basically the structure of it was what he designed and built, perhaps with the help of a famous architect. And part of the point in seeing this picture is just how this is only a kilometre or two from the shore of the loch Cromarty, and you can see that the hills that we talked about, they're not insignificant, are they? These ones behind the house, and they're not that far behind it either. What do we learn about the population in this parish from the Old Statistical Account? This is what the minister says. He says that in 1794, that's the most recent figures he's got available, the population was 1,100 odd, yeah? And actually it wasn't all that different from what they'd counted all those years earlier, 40 years before. That was about 1,100 as well. But here's the thing, now look at this, the analysis of the population is, of the 1,100 odd, only 800 of them are above the age of 7. So, you know, 300 of them are kids, little kids. And of course, they're not going to be counted, are they, if you come to look at other statistics in terms of being adults, I mean, and work or whatever. So, and this is some of the information about how many marriages and burials and so on. You can see there are a lot more baptisms than there are burials, which is probably a good thing. Now let's look at the number of poor that you find in the parish. You know, that's quite interesting to us, the underprivileged. It's a big thing in Scotland that they have this poor laws, and the parish support the poor and needy in the parish. And they apply, and they have to know where they came from, where they're born. You know, that's part of the deal, that if you come from there, they'll look after you, even if you don't no longer living in that parish. So it tells us there is the Old Statistical Account tells us there is a considerable number on the poor roll, 70 of them. That's, you know, you think about the number of adults we just saw a minute ago. That's about 1,100 minus 300 is 800. So you've got nearly 10% of the population of adults, or over 7 really, and maybe larger of adults, nearly 10% are on the poor roll. So quite a large number, really. Considerable is what it is. That's really interesting, isn't it? And normally it's paid out of weekly collections, and of course the poor, usually the ordinary people, don't contribute much to the plate on a Sunday because they don't have any money. But in this parish, there's also donations being made by worthy citizens earlier, and the interest on those donations is used to help cover the poor support. And then it says, since 1774, Sir Hector has ordered a very liberal and charitable bounty of 12 bowls of oatmeal to be annually distributed amongst the poor in the parish. Now, this bowl is a term that I find a bit confusing, and no wonder, because actually it varies from one place to the other and from one type of product to the other. But as far as I can tell, that 12 bowls of oatmeal, meaning porridge type material, amounts to the considerable amount of 768 kilograms. A lot. That's a lot of porridge. Someone's got a microphone on.
Bruce?
Yeah.
I was curious about that as well, and it changes as to what grain you're looking at.
Yeah.
But in the case of oatmeal, it's 140 pounds to a bowl.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Imperial pounds. That's the number I used, 140. Yeah. And 12 bowls equals 140 kilos, avoir du poids, as you call it, times 12 is that number I quoted, 768 kilos. Now then he goes on to talk about the Old Statistical Account, the character of the people. This is quite good, isn't it? Naturally judicious and acute, possessing considerable vigour of mental facilities. Tick. On the whole, industrious and sober. Tick. With a few exceptions of good morals. Tick. So far, so good, eh? Abstain carefully from profane swearing and rarely utter an oath. Tick. Pay sacred attention to the Sabbath. Regard to the Sabbath, meaning they don't, polish their shoes on a Sunday, and so on. And then the interesting thing here is that he says they all belong to the established church. That is really an amazing thing. You think I think this is one of the exceptions, because we'll see when we look at the other parishes. I'm sure that there will be some other denominations, meaning probably Roman Catholics and maybe some other dissenters, as they're called, who don't follow the main church. But in this parish, everybody follows the established church. I suppose the minister likes to think of it that way too. He's writing it, don't forget who the author is. But then he says, and this I don't think is a tick, it's a bit hard, you've got to read between the lines, I think, with this next line. It says, some do not distinguish between the means and the end of religion. I'd like to hear somebody's point of view on that, what you might think that means. You're chickening out. Susan's ready for an answer.
I have no idea.
I think it means that they, observe the customs of the religion rather than see the final goal, you might say. More in the means than the ends, yeah? I think that's what it means, but I'd be open to any suggestion on that. And then he talks about the church itself. He says of the church that it was built or rebuilt 15 years ago, and it's neatly finished and a decent and comfortable place of worship. This is very nice. Now, bear in mind that we're going to see that it wasn't until the 1815s, that sort of date, that the Telford churches were being built in most other parishes in Scotland. They were government-built churches on Telford's design. But here, obviously, the Heritors have built the church 15 years earlier. And a new manse had just been built 2 years earlier. Maybe he had an expanding family, the minister, and he says it's superior to the generality of ministers' houses in other parishes. And it was fully paid for by the landlords. All good. He's pretty happy with that. He says the minister's stipend is 128 bowls of victual, and that in addition to that, he gets the stipend of £36, 10 shillings, and an allowance for the communion, wine and so on. And the Heritors have concurred to an augmented stipend. Good, eh? So just think of this. This is the church here, right? That was It was rebuilt 15 years ago and is a decent and comfortable place of worship. Now let's look at this. This is my photo. I just took it really of this MacLennan headstone here in the churchyard in Alness because of my interest in it. Kathy's in my interest. And you can see what state the church is in behind there today. I took this photo, I think, in 2010. This is a Roderick here whose son died in the First World War. This one here, I think it is. One of those is the son who died in the First World War, Roderick. And that's his ID number. But I'm only looking at the church here. Was, you know, comfortable and nice place of worship. This is what it looked like before it became dilapidated, roofless. And you can see there, I'm very lucky to have found this. It took me ages to find a photo like this, but you know, it's quite a substantial church compared to most Scottish parish churches. And just have a look at this section here, and I'll just go back to the previous slide. And you can see that same section there in the, see, that's that section. I guess it's the vestibule or something. I'm not sure which is the front. Maybe this is the front. The manse is over here, we think. And there's the headstones there. I don't know when this photo was taken, obviously. Before the roof came off in the 1970s, so it might have been not that long ago. Here's the minister. We saw him from the FASTI. This is what you would do normally in a presentation like this. You'd say who was the minister and who were his predecessors, like what who are the people in the parish. You know, we saw earlier that he grew up in the MacLennan part of the world, Glen Shiel, where he would have known his father would have buried people in that graveyard that we all know from the top corner of our genealogy pages. Went to King's College, that's in Aberdeen, and then he went out to Harris for his first appointment. His predecessors in this parish are very interesting because, you know, this is the time when King Charles, the one who got beheaded, was trying to force bishops onto the Scottish church, and with not much success. And so part of his pressure involved banishing several of the ministers who had been in this parish, including one who was banished to the American plantations. That's what the FASTI tells us, that, you know, this minister was banished to the American plantations. I guess that means Virginia, probably, as most of those people who were sent. Remember we looked at that in the migrations, about the numbers who went to what Australians would call convicts, who went to America, or prisoners as they're called in America. And one of those who were banished, his son came back to become the minister in the parish, this parish, and became very famous. Maybe that's why the church was built. And we saw this fellow's name on that FASTI I showed you very early on the left side there, where we saw Angus Bethune. And he was very famous, one of the most popular ministers in the north. Reverend Angus himself was presented by George III, yeah? So you can see here, this is like the connection between how you get appointed and who appoints you. And in this case, it's, you know, the king himself appoints the minister to the parish, which of course becomes the source of this problem later with the free church. And in fact, if you look at the Monroe's book that I showed you, it has lots of talk about which of the family supported which ministers to become the minister of particular parishes and who failed to agree with the others. And, you know, my guy didn't get up and this sort of thing. You know, it's very controversial who becomes the minister, and it's being argued about by the landlords. This fellow here, Angus Bethune, died in 1901 and was succeeded by his son, Hector Bethune. Here's a little picture. This shows you the connection with the Glen Shiel parish. This is the burying ground of Glen Shiel as well as Kintail, remember? And you see that this fellow was born in Skye, and he went from, after he finished as a minister in Glen Shiel, he came to live with his son in Alness, right? So he would have known that church very well. So this is a fellow who's seen and baptised and buried lots of MacLennans, is now living in that manse there and attending services in the Glen Shield Church, where his son, Angus, who wrote the Old Statistical Account, is the minister. And he married the daughter of the minister of Lochalsh, Margaret. So he's, right in with the church there around the MacLennan part of the world, Kintail area. And here's Angus himself. He marries a daughter of a colonel, Andrew Munro. We talked about. Notice that the first child of this marriage here is Margaret, who marries a minister from Glenelg. So there's another connection just over the hill in Glenelg to the church from this family. And here the other one, the fifth child, called John, like the father, born in 1746 in Glen Shield. He goes to the parish just up the road of Dornoch. And he marries a Munro, what do you know, who is himself a minister of Etterton, just up the road, on the next firth up there, the Dornoch firth. This family here, here's Hector. He's the minister of Alness after his father, and that's from 1802. Father died 1801, yeah, to 1820. So Kathy and my great-great-grandfather was baptised in this church by this fellow while he was there. So you can see this has a real connection to us, this fella, the son of the one who wrote the Old Statistical Account, because he was baptised in 1815. This is the line of my wife's family here. This is my wife's grandfather. And so you can see that my great-great-grandfather being baptised by this guy, and we're coming back together further down the line. You like that, Melanie? And two of these sons go off to New Zealand. This one here goes to New Zealand on really, it's the first migrant ship to arrive in Wellington, New Zealand, now the capital. In 1839, he goes on the Cuba. And remember that this guy lives just a few doors up from Captain Donald MacLennan, who was in New Zealand in 1803. You can't tell me he didn't go and talk to the captain a few doors down the road about what it was like over there in New Zealand, because Captain Donald was still alive in 1839. And here's the headstone in the Dingwall churchyard, just up from Captain Donald's castle. And in fact, Captain Donald's memorial like this, it looks very similar to this, is just nearby. It's only, 10 metres away, a bit less maybe. And yeah, so here you go. As it turned out, this fellow's son was born in the parish right next to Alness on a return visit of this fellow. This is Prue's grandfather at a place called Balcony Castle. Now, we're trying also in these sessions to look at the health, housing, diet, that sort of thing. But in fact, there's not very much in the statistical account about those things. So I suggest that we'll cover those. I know you will cover them because some of the other ministers do talk about those aspects in their reports, or you'll find other sources. He did say that, it does say that there had been no rent increases apart from sheep runs on the Novar estate since Sir Hector took possession of it. But generally speaking, this topic isn't very well covered by this particular account, not by all of them, but by this particular one. This is getting near the end of these slides now. We're talking here about the language and the schools that were in the district, how many there were and what the level of education might have been like. We know that the Gaelic was the native language of the people, and sometimes they call it this name. You see that name in the older sources. It sort of means the Irish, really. It's like that same word as like air. It says that the upper ranks, you might call them, higher ranks, owners and so on, seldom speak the Gaelic, although they often understand it, of course. But you'd be sure that the minister would have to speak the Gaelic. It says there that English is made quote, considerable progress over the last 20 years. And that's partly due to these parochial schools. Remember we looked at those before, the parochial school, that means the ones that are funded by the landlords, not by any of the government or anything, but by the landlords. And it varied a great deal from one part to the other. But here we have 60 children. And bear in mind, there are probably something like 300 under 7. That might give you a bit of an idea, those school age kids. They're not all going to school, that's what that means. In the upper parts of the higher parts of the parish, there are these schools that we saw in the previous session had been established by the Society for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. Do you remember this society? It was the one that was really about, you know, promoting being good royalists, really that's the word to put, and was very much about king and country and we're all one nation and, you know, we're not got separate identity and so on. I'm not sure really whether he meant 60 altogether at these 2 schools or 60 each, but we know that one of the schools was for girls where the main subjects were spinning and knitting stockings, socks. How many MacLennans do we find? By looking at the clan records, we can see that there are some, plenty of MacLennans live here, have lived here. The notes, you know, the notes search, I recommended that you use that quite a lot. That's on the main page. You have the word notes and you just put in a single word and it comes back with a response. So if you put in this unusual word, Alness, you get to 426 pages, people who have a connection to that name. And that it includes, unfortunately, of course, if you've got a census that has some one person, it might even be a farm servant or a you know, domestic servant who have a connection to Alness. So you get those which aren't very relevant to us. So that's a bit of, but you'll see some, that's a bit of a clue. You should always do that search if you're preparing these notes. But you've got, over the whole time, we've got 94 births with that parish, 30 deaths and 13 marriages with in our clan records for this parish. That's quite interesting. I noted this particular one here, interesting. It's got this one 64150, that's her ID number. She died in this part in the upper parts of the parish that we now know more about. She died in the 1870s, and so she had been born in the 1790s, and she describes her father in her death record as being this meal miller that came from that upper part of the parish. So that's, you know, a good connection, isn't it? How does it fit in with the overall picture of MacLennans generally? How much prominence does it have? Well, it's not that prominent. It's very much a middling one that we see. You know that clan statistics that we have linked from the dark menu on the left-hand side, clan stats. You can go in and see these pie charts for the births in each decade. So this is the decade just after the period we're talking about, the first one we do it for, from 1800 to 1809, the 10 years. And you can see here I'm on the second of 4 pages of these pie charts to get that list there. But these are the parishes, how significant they are. You can see Gairloch in that particular decade dominates the number of people that are born in, and it's quite a big parish as well, so it's a bit of a swizz that later they split it into North and South Gairloch and wouldn't look quite so big on this pie chart. But you can see Gairloch, Fodderty, Applecross, Compton, these parishes that we all know and love. And then you keep coming around, and this one here is Alness, which has 0.9% of the births for that period, just that decade. And there it is there. That's the colour that you can see up here. And that's how you find out about the number of, how significant it was in that particular decade, if you're looking at this. So ranked 23rd. I hope you'll use those stats quite often. Now, just before we finish, a couple of curiosities. Firstly, I want to show you that if you go there, you can find these couple of quite quirky things that you might be interested to find out. One is an 8th century, that's a long time ago, burial ground and chapel that most people don't know about. And the other one is a folly the 1790s folly, built during this time that we're talking about. This is the first one here. This is, you can see here Novar, you remember where that was on the map. Here's Avanton, this is the border of Alness, this river here. And then in this the treed area, you have this 8th century burial ground and chapel that really is only, but people earlier described as being bodies, that you could see actual bodies in containers. It's just up behind that Ascent house in the trees. But you can see pictures of it online, you know, the undulate, not a lot left there, but you can see shapes in the ground where the burial had taken place. Chapel of Firish was there a long time ago, isn't it? 8th century. And this is the other quirky thing here. This is the Firish monument. It's up on a hill behind here's the lock down here, lock Cromarty. And this is this thing. It's the shape of a gateway to a city in the southeast of India that was conquered by Sir Hector, General Sir Hector. And, you know, the spin that goes out about it, this is a bit like a, you know, politician spin, is that it was built to provide employment for the people who at that time were very poor and unemployed in the 1790s. So that's a clue, though, that people did think that they were poor and needed some support. And apparently a lot of the work was not so much in actually building it, but carting the stones up there. That was what they got paid some pittance to do. And it's quite hard to get to. It's quite a steep hill, and the parking lot, the official parking place for it, is quite a long way away. And you can see, just to prove that I was there, that I'm in this photo. And this is that pier that goes out into the sea. But it's quite a long way. I'd recommend it though, even so, but do take some water and things, because there are not many facilities up there. And here's another look the other way. This is that pier sticking out, and here's an oil rig. That's typically what you see in this lock today. They come in for repairs from the North Sea. And look up here, look what you see up there. You see it? Looking the other way, up on the top of the hill. So, you know, you don't walk this way. You come over the back and park over there, and you walk all the way. And it's quite bare up on the top because it's above the tree line. Okay, before we finish, this is the typical ending to any class, lesson, whatever you like to call it. Let's review the objectives we set out to achieve today in our talk. We aim to use the Old Statistical Account and the FASTI, the maps and other resources, to better understand everyday life in the parish of Alness in the 1790s. To that end, we looked at the topography, the location, the extent and the produce of the area, and we looked at, I've got another person waiting. We looked at the heritors that were there and the ministers, and we looked at the population and the employment that was available to them from the activities, the morals and the poor that were in the parish. We tried to look at the health and the housing and the diet, but we didn't achieve much in that. So that's an unachieved objective. We looked at how many MacLennans were there, and finally we finished off by looking at a few curiosities that you might have been entertained by and might look to go and see if you go to that part of the world.